Good evening and welcome to the second of our autumn programme webinar talks. I'm Gillian Coates, I'm the Vice Chair of OCS and Planning Group Coordinator. Before introducing our speaker, I'd like to just outline how we'll proceed because I think this is very helpful. The session will last for an hour. We'll have 45 minutes for the talk and 15 minutes for questions. To make the best use of our time, all participants will be muted during the talk and we'll restrict questions to the end. If a question arises during the presentation, please use the chat button at the bottom of the screen to submit your question. At the end of the talk, Ian Salisbury, our programme organiser, will chair the question and answer session, and then I will close the session. So, tonight, our speaker is Dr Paul Jepson. He'll provide an overview of rewilding from a European perspective and will discuss the potential for rewilding in and around Oxford. Paul Jepson makes the case for an enabling policy space for rewilding as a new and complementary conservation approach in Europe. His latest book with Kane Blythe, The Radical New Science of Ecological Recovery, which was published in August this year, has received positive reviews, including one in the Financial Times, and another written by Isabella Tree, author of the best-selling book Wilding, published in 2019. Isabella says, Jepson and Blythe have done a masterly job explaining the science behind rewilding in an accessible, honest and compelling way. It deserves to be widely read and become a book of great influence. So a little bit about Paul. Paul Jepson is course director of Oxford University's Master of Science in Biodiversity, Conservation and Management. He's also a senior research fellow with the Smith School of Enterprise for the Environment. He's held senior research fellowships with the Environmental Change Unit and the Scholes Centre for Social Entrepreneurship at the Side Business School in Oxford. Paul came to academia after a successful career in conservation management and policy. He's consulted for a wide range of intergovernmental and non-governmental organisations and was Indonesia Programme Coordinator for BirdLife International from 1991 till 1997. He started as a government countryside officer developing new urban conservation initiatives in Manchester and Shrewsbury. Paul is also Nature Recovery Lead at the environmental consultancy Ecosulis and serves on the supervisory board of Rewilding Europe. His research interests focus on the geographies of conservation governance with particular reference to long-term interests in protected areas, wildlife trade, conservation history, attitudes, values and practices, media representations and conservation issues, and the role, accountability and legitimacy of conservation NGOs. Through his scientific publications and work at Oxford, he's making an invaluable contribution to the development of rewilding as a conservation narrative in Europe and beyond. So with no further delay, may I introduce you to Paul Jepson. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you very much, Gillian. Good evening, everybody. It's a shame I can't see you all, but it's lovely to be with you in person. Just let me share my screen for a moment. I need to start with a slight apology, Gillian, because Gillian did send me the introduction to check and I didn't have time. Actually, as it happens, I left the university a couple of years ago to join a consultancy, Ecosulis, partly because I really wanted to see if I could make rewilding happen, rather than just research it and teach it. So apologies for that, Gillian. Anyhow, it's a real pleasure to have this opportunity to talk about rewilding with you all. What I was planning to do in this talk is to sort of start off with a little characterization, if you like, of rewilding, then to give you some of the science behind it, just in a nutshell. I won't go too heavy on that, but I think it is really quite important to understand the significance of the theory, if you like, of rewilding. Then I'm going to take us to the Netherlands and introduce you to what we might call the practical origins of rewilding and the impact that has had both in the way we think about doing rewilding in Europe and actually the rise of rewilding initiatives across Europe. And then to end up, I'll pose that question: could we think about rewilding in Oxford with a couple of suggestions, maybe? And I hope that will prompt discussion. So I thought let's just start with this question I find quite interesting. The question of why now? Why are we talking about rewilding in 2020? Why weren't we discussing rewilding in 2000 or 1980? Or why has it happened now and not, 20 years hence? And it is really quite extraordinary, as Gillian mentioned in her introduction. We've got this sort of raft of popular books coming out. Isabella Tree's book on wilding. I mean, she was on bestseller on Desert Island Discs. I mean, the idea that my, modest science book could be reviewed in the Financial Times was a little bit of a surprise. I could have bored you with a graph here and put a graph of the rise in scientific and academic publications in rewilding, or news media articles, and it just shows this exponential rise since about 2005. So rewilding is very much a discussion, a concept of our times, and it seems to be hitting a zeitgeist. And I don't have any particular evidence of this, but we think about it, us rewilders talk about what it might be. And I think for me, there's 4 or 5 things which are coming together. The one on the left, if you can see that picture of the Living Planet Index, and the latest one was published just last week, and it shows this really rather depressing decline of nature since the 1970s. And I feel this quite well in my heart, because I started birding in the early 70s when I was a teenager, and nowadays there just isn't as many birds to go and watch and enjoy. And this is prompting the view amongst, if you like, rewilders, that it's time to try something different. We can't just go on with the current way of doing conservation, which really came to the fore in the 1970s and 80s and hasn't been able to halt this decline. It's time to try something fresh. That's interacting with something I'll talk about, some really quite big advances in ecological science, our understanding of ecosystems, Earth at different scales, both spatial up to the planet and way back in time, which has really been enabled probably in the last 20 years by advances in computation. And linked to this, and this is what I'll touch on in the third part of the talk, there's this sort of rise of inspiring pioneer projects where this new science is just being put into practice, but actually the practice, the innovation is also informing the science. There's this really exciting dynamic going on. And then there's also this rising desire in society for wilder natures. And there's just an enthusiasm for it. And it might be linked to the rise of rising value of experiences, which is sort of linked to technology. What do you buy someone for Christmas now? You can't buy them an album anymore because they can stream them or whatever. But experiences are becoming really valuable. These authentic embodied experiences. And of course, wilder natures, safari type experiences, there's a growing demand for those, particularly closer to home, because who can afford to take a family to Africa or wherever? And then a big thing, which I think we need to keep in mind here, is this window of opportunity to bring about, if you like, transformational change in how we think about conserving and restoring nature. In the UK, this is really aided by Brexit and the fact that we're coming out of the common agricultural policy, which creates the opportunity to do things quite differently within our landscape. But more generally, because a lot of conservation legislation was set up in the 1970s and 80s, it's all coming up for review. So that would be my little answer to why is rewilding here now. But it does seem to be chiming for whatever those reasons are. And it might be useful, just to throw out a definition of rewilding. I don't particularly like doing definitions because, sometimes it's the significance and meaning that matters. But this one is sort of the working definition of what is rewilding. And it's this idea that actually we can understand rewilding as spaces of innovation. There's been very little innovation in the way we conserve and restore nature over the last 30 years. We call it an innovation deficit in our sector, in our field, in our conservation movement. And these spaces of innovation, they're not only in the practice, they're also really quite creative and innovative thinking in the theory and science. So that's one aspect of it. The second aspect is the real focus on restoring the sort of dynamic interactions in ecosystems, sort of rebuilding ecosystems. I'll come to this a little bit more in a moment. And a big focus on actually doing this through the reintroduction or restoration of what in the jargon is called functional species, but these are larger species, ecosystem engineers, species which actually shape the ecosystems. They don't just live off them, if you like. And also the restoration of natural disturbances. So those are sort of what rewilding is about from a scientific, a policy, a practical point of view. But also it's quite interesting, I think, just to think, it's really interesting how different people react to rewilding. I think it's because of this prefix re, which, as you probably know, has a dual meaning. It can mean again, or it can mean back. So some people hear rewilding and think, oh, you know, it's going backwards, it's going to, you know, exclude us from the land, it's the return of the Scottish clearances, or, you know, middle class people in cities telling the rural folks what to do, you know. So it can have very negative connotations. But really, rewilding, and I hope this will come across in my talk, is all about the notion of again. It's much more linked to concepts of urban regeneration. You know, when I started my career in Manchester in urban regeneration, Manchester wasn't thinking of going back to its industrial past. It was thinking of taking inspirations from its past to reinvent itself for, you know, in those times, you know, the late 20th century. So it's much more about these, you know, concepts of recovering, refreshing, reimagining, recreating, reinvigorating in it. That's really the spirit of the people sort of shaping and taking forward rewilding. But of course, you can imagine how that sort of dual thing can really well be played into by the media. And maybe also because I'm sure many of you, you know, are familiar with conservation. You know, I can't see you to sort of get a vote or a reaction to that, but go to our nature reserves and enjoy our nature reserves. So you might be wondering, well, now how does rewilding relate to conventional conservation, if you like, what we're familiar with, what we do in the UK? Is it a repackaging or is it something different? Well, fundamentally, it is very different. So the way we manage nature in the UK is really, we manage it to achieve prescribed states. By that, I mean these sort of ideas on what, you know, a nature should be, a particular habitat type, or what a particular species needs. And then we're managing it to deliver conservation targets or whatever. So it's quite a static, highly managed, can be a very evidence-based form of nature conservation. Rewilding, on the other point, is about restoring the interactions between different components of an ecosystem and then letting those interactions shape the future of what that nature will be, what that nature will become. So rewilding is, in that sense, you know, this is why we call it the radical new science, because we're saying that rather than us, it's almost like, you know, they sometimes say that the hardest thing for rewilders to do, or any conservationist to do, is keep your hands in the pocket and let nature decide what it wants to be, rather than managing it to produce a nature which we think is right as humans. So it is quite radical in that sense. And as you can imagine, that there's quite a lot of resistance to doing that, because it involves embracing uncertainty, surprise, you know, novelty, things which actually we're not so used to in our way of managing nature. And it, you know, and it may involve losing some things which we've come to cherish, and we can talk about that in the discussion if you'd like. So here's my quick tour of the science of rewilding, just a nutshell, you know, sort of brief overview of it. And I mentioned earlier that computation and technology is really helping. It's really, I mean, if you're an ecologist, these are exciting times, because there's all of these new insights opening up. And one of the big insights, or one of the things we're able to understand much more, is how past ecosystems were. and how ecosystems changed over time. And we now know that this scene you're looking at here from, I think it's a scene from Spain of 10 to 15,000 years ago. This scene of, it's almost a bit of an African scene with mosaics, with woodland and grassland mosaics, herds of large herbivores roaming about it. This was the, if you like, the default situation across most of the planet, including Europe. And the interactions between the herbivores and the vegetation, they actually shaped the mosaics, and they created really rich and diverse microhabitats. And this in turn created an abundance of species and an abundance of individual animals. So about around about 15,000 years ago, we now know that we lived in a world of megafauna, as they're called, and abundant nature. But then, 25,000 years ago, we had the second wave of human expansion out of Africa. And that second wave was much more intelligent, organized, and had the language, had the sort of cognitive revolution of being able to imagine and all of these sort of things. And they swept across, not swept in terms of, over thousands of years, they moved out of Africa into Europe and across Central Asia, Siberia, and into the Americas. And along that route, they hunted and they lived off the megafauna. These are the mammoth hunters. I could show you pictures of all the incredible animals which were hunted out in the Americas. BW-sized armadillos and that. And this was a process which, in evolutionary terms, was very rapid, perhaps over 1,000, 2,000 years. That these large herbivores, they just couldn't withstand hunting pressure, and gradually, they died out. And then the ones which didn't die out, like the mammoths, we domesticated them. They became a cow. And over time, we structured, in Europe, we structured our landscapes into sort of different bits the herbivores did. So we had our arable lands, which was, like pigs rooting or whatever. We had our woodlands, which was the more dynamic things. We had scrubby areas and so forth. So for many years, centuries, millennia, nature was still going pretty well because in some ways we still were herding livestock, and a lot of the process was still going on. And this is the nature which our Victorian ancestors experienced. So the boom of natural history back in the mid 19th century, 1860s, 1870s, when Darwin was all the rage. People were going out to nature from the cities, and going out into the countryside from cities, and it all seemed natural. But they were going with that natural historian mind, which was about classifications and comparing, so we can understand the big science questions of those days. And what they inadvertently did, they classified and structured all of those different elements of nature into habitats. And this is what we now protect, these sort of different types of habitats, and try and protect the assemblages with them. But over time, of course, with modern agriculture, those have all broken down, and they've become more degraded, and they've become further and further simplified. And this goes into another insight, which was very, influential in the rewilding science. And it actually comes from fisheries science, and it's called the shifting baseline syndrome. And what it says is that as humans, the nature we experienced in our youth, that is the natural. We just assume that, we see it in our kids, oh yeah, it's great nature, this is how it is. Yeah. And then we take that forward, but because of this, every generation thinks that what is natural is a declining natural. So the baseline of what we understand as abundance, every generation it's getting lower and lower and lower. And this is termed the shifting baseline syndrome. And over time, we come to conserve and cherish an ever more degraded nature of this. And we look at this scene here, this is Snowdonia National Park. And I went up this, we went as a family trip up this Whitsun, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago. And in 3 hours walk up and down there, I saw 7 birds on it. And yet actually we cherish this because it feels wild and bleak and the landscapes look dramatic on it. But ecologically, it's really quite degraded now. And this was this idea which has been really influential in rewilding, that over the millennia, over the centuries, maybe just over the decades, over generations, we have come to internalize ecological impoverishment in our culture, in our policy, and in our institutions of government, and actually just what we do. It's sort of there. And that recognition has been if you like, it's been a big eye-opener, because it says, well, okay, if we're aware of that, well, we could change that. We can choose to give ecosystems an upgrade, and actually to recover richer natures and reset that shifting baseline syndrome in an upward trajectory, if that makes sense. So this slide, and I apologize for it being a bit, complicated looking, but this is a summary of the theory and science of rewilding. And if I could just point you to 3 things on the triangular side, that if we want to do that restoration, the ecosystem upgrading, the scientific theory is really quite strong on this now. It says, like, we want to sort of move up on these axes. So at the moment we're down here in this very impoverished triangle in the middle. We can restore ecosystems by increasing the ability of animals or species to disperse over landscapes and over time, by increasing what technically is called trophic complexity. And by that means the web of life, just bringing it out again, building up the web of life, and then increasing natural disturbance. These are the 3 main things which we have over the centuries and decades reduced down into this little triangle where nature's hanging on in the middle. And the other side of this, and this goes back to this idea on the herbivores creating many microhabitats, we now know that it's the herbivores which, if you like, spin up all of those interactions within the ecosystems. So if we can reassemble our large herbivore guilds within the constraints of what's possible, this is one of the key ideas within rewilding. And it's interesting this, because I often get journalists ring up and say, oh yeah, can you give us a quote or say something about rewilding? They always want to talk about wolves. They always want to talk about lynx. They always want to talk about the predators. But actually the core of rewilding science and practice is about thinking of ways from the animal perspective of it, of how could we bring back large herbivores into our landscapes and into our cultures. And the reason this is because they're big animals, they're walking, vats, if you like, and they do lots of things. They smash down vegetation, they nibble vegetation, so you get lots of structure. They scuff things around, so you get lots of natural disturbance. Wild cattle, or the bulls make pits and so forth. So you constantly got this disturbance going on. They're defecating all the time, so they're enriching the soil and they're creating a microhabitat for beetles and so forth. They scar trees, so you've got all of these little places where spiders can live, and then willow ticks can live off the spiders. So they're just these massive ecosystem engineers. And of course, something else which we've totally lost sight of in Europe now is that when they die, they form carcasses which create what we call a scavenger ecology. So they create another dimension of the ecosystem. And this is a lovely way to think, because you look at things totally different. It's like, oh, why do I put fat balls out in the winter for blue tits and great tits? Why do they want to eat fats? It's because actually they were adapted to feed off the fatty tissue in carcasses of large herbivores. That's where these little birds eat, that's where they've got a taste, if you like, from fat balls from. So one of the nice things about rewilding science is it just prompts you to think in ways which you hadn't thought, or to think about the taken for granted sometimes. And then one of the interesting things in Europe, and there's a bit of history to this, because Neanderthal people were in Europe for a long time, there was a bit of a co-evolution between the large herbivores and humans, such that when the second wave of humans came into, Homo sapiens came into Europe, their impact wasn't as great as it was in, for instance, Eastern Asia on that. And one of the interesting things is that although we've lost some pretty amazing stuff like the Irish elk and cave bears, we have a good set of large herbivores remaining, which we could rewild if we wanted to. If you like, the challenge, and perhaps one of the exciting things about rewilding, sorry, I beg your pardon, is that some of these megafauna are what we call culturally extinct. And by that, I mean, we don't even think of them anymore as wild European species. So if we think of three species, the wild horse of Europe, which, we used to have wild horses roaming all across Europe. We did have some water buffalo in Europe, and we had the wild cattle auroch. Now we only know those as domestic species. So they're still with us, but we call them horses, cows, and water buffalo, they're hardly with us. So they are still with us, and we could bring them back into recreating the herds and guilds of herbivores. Other species, we've just forgotten they ever existed in Europe in culture. Maybe some of you realise that wild ass was a native species of Europe, but most people think, wild ass, what are you on about? Isn't that something, I think I might have heard about it from the steppes. Well, actually, this animal was really quite common across the whole of the Mediterranean and up into the Iberian Peninsula. And then other species, we think are American rather than European. And this is the buffalo, where again, I think for years, I assumed that bison and buffalo were American. I'd seen them all in the cowboy and Indian movies. And it was a bit of a realization when I realized that actually bison evolved in Europe and Central Asia, and a long time ago migrated into the Americas. So we've got this sort of cultural extinction, and part of rewilding is about reminding people and then reimagining how we could put those animals, reassemble that lost, if you like, the lost megafauna of Europe. So I'm going to move on to the practice of rewilding. And in some ways, the practice of rewilding, the sort of science has caught up a little bit with the practice of rewilding. And it all started in the Netherlands, just across the channel for us, around about in the mid-1980s, around about 1985 and 1986, at a place called the Oostvaardersplassen, which is about 40 minutes outside Amsterdam. And this land is quite big. It's 5,000 hectares, which, what will that be, 10,000 acres? It's quite a big area. It was actually reclaimed from the sea to create a polder and then an industrial estate. But because by chance the economic downturn around the oil crisis, it was just abandoned, and nature started recovering. And a group of radical ecologists led by this guy, Frans Vera, they were sort of observing what was going on with the succession of this land and the role of geese, actually, grazing geese. It attracted big flocks of grazing geese. How their grazing was actually steering the way that the new nature was developing on this land. And that's where he got this insight that grazing mattered. And that's where they came up with this, just a crazy idea at the time of, why don't we do that, deliver that vision I just described of reassembling the lost herbivore guilds of Europe. So they brought in conic horses from Poland, which are a very old breed, very close to the original wild horse of Europe, the tarpan. They brought in another animal called, it's actually called het kottel, which was a sort of mimic, if you like, of the auroch, reintroduced red deer, and created this Serengeti-like landscape, which, well, I heard about this in 2005, and immediately took our students over there. And in some ways, this is what prompted Oxford's, or our interest in rewilding and rewilding research. So quite a radical experiment, just shaking up everything. No one had ever seen scenes like this in Europe. Whoops, sorry. Oh, I beg your pardon. Oh, sorry, I've just lost my mouse here. I'm going the wrong way. All right, there we go. Beg your pardon. And the key idea here, a very radical idea, was this notion of de-domestication in it, which really was starting to be pioneered at the Oostvaarderplassen. And this was this idea that, the auroch and the tarpan aren't extinct. We just call them a horse and a cow. If we selectively bred them to be livestock, why can't we backbreed them to create, an analogue, a replicate, a functional analogue of those lost species? And again, this is really aided by technology. So one of the things which has really developed is our ability to extract DNA from ancient bones. And now that there is 4 full genomes of the auroch, and the backbreeders can sort of use that as a guide, taking primitive European breeds of cattle and using it as a guide to backbreed quite rapidly something which genetically is similar to the extinct auroch. And these are them. I hope you agree, they look fantastic animals. And of course, some of us, there's no photos of what an auroch looked like, so it's just our imagining, but they seem to fit the cave paintings and the sketches of them. And certainly they seem to act within the ecosystem like an auroch on that. So that was the first, if you like, experiment in rewilding, and it was quite closed. People weren't allowed in. It really was sort of a scientific experiment in nature conservation. But then there was a second generation of rewilding in the Netherlands, and this was really it started up around the city of Nijmegen on the German border, and it was a response to a number of challenges that the Netherlands was facing. One of the challenges was that their river management just wasn't working anymore in the face of climate change. Another challenge was they really didn't have, the Dutch Delta, there wasn't much nature left in it, so there's a real demand for new nature. And here this vision of a very a big scale project started emerging. And I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but just down here is this city of Nijmegen. And as with climate change, they were getting much stronger floods, big pulses coming down here. And there was a real risk because of this bend in the River Waal that Nijmegen was just going to get hammered by floods and floods. And at the same time, they were really having some very high summer floods, which were flooding all of this land you can see in the green space here. And this land here was the summer dike was on the outside here, and the winter dike was on the outside there. So the project, which has taken 25 years, was to rewild the river, so to re-excavate the original river braids of this river and to allow this to become a natural rewilded system. And part of this was, there's always many more people involved, but one of the leaders here was a guy called Wouter Helmer, sort of more understated guy. But unlike Frans, this Wouter is really a nature entrepreneur. He's about, how can we scale the rewilding? How can we make it happen? How can we link rewilding with the forces of economics, economy, and society? If we really want to restore nature as a force, then we've got to link it to the other forces which shape our future. And of course, economics is a big one on that. So Wouter set up a small NGO called Arc Nature, which was a sort of innovative NGO, and started off by the whole project by just creating a new vision, a story of what the Dutch Delta could be. And he did this by acquiring 3 hectares of land, acquiring some conic horses, and then making videos of them galloping up and down his 3 hectares of land and creating this image of, hey, you know what, we could move from this really flat, highly intensive agricultural delta to have horses galloping free across the delta. And it caught the public imagination, this, and from that sort of things started going up, sort of taking off. Then, with the help of WWF Netherlands, and this is where a real pragmatic streak comes into rewilding. So that, well, how could we finance buying this land off the farmers and then, you know, restoring it to braiding rivers? They realised that one of the problems in the Netherlands was that there was a shortage of aggregates for the building industry, you know, for building houses. So they did a deal with an aggregates mining company to buy the land, excavate the gravel and sands. There was 2 brick companies which were built on the land, and that was the financial driver for the rewilding. Along the way, because you know this was a constant thing, as the river started moving again, they introduced iconic species, cultural species, which, you know, would capture the news, capture the public attention, build interest in it, attract interest from other progressive professionals in it, you know, species like the storks, the beavers, and so forth. And then they also were very good at just making it public. So it wasn't a reserve you couldn't go in. It was a place to rewild the self. There still is, there's just a little sign at the gate, and then you just go in and do what you want. And the idea is that if there's a lot of large animals roaming about, and if it's marshy and lots of water, people will just create their own paths and then keep to them. There may be a few people who want to go in and explore. I was one of them once. I went to go and find beaver, and I went in and had an exciting wild time. But there's rather few people who want to do that. So you can just allow the people to rewild themselves and have that spirit as well as the nature. And then the last thing is that they built on this. They created eco enterprises off it. So, you know, the herds of the horses, the herds of the cattle built up, and now they're owned by an eco enterprise which both manages them, you know, looks after them because somebody needs to be responsible for them, and runs a very nice wild meat business off them. So if you live in Nijmegen this time of the year, you can pick up your freezer pack of wild cattle, and actually amazing, they're even selling wild horse meat now after 15 years. Okay, just a little bit attentive to the time here, so I'll just move on. So what we've got from this is this wonderful 5,000 hectare now, after 20 years, natural asset outside the city of Nijmegen. You can just cycle down there. You see the dynamic river that it's created. The sand dunes in the river there, so you can go sunbathing in sand dunes right in the centre of, on the German-Netherlands border. And all these opportunities for fantastic recreational experiences. So this very pragmatic sort of entrepreneurial philosophy of rewilding is the one which is driving the expansion of rewilding out across Europe. There's the main organisation that Wouter and Frans Scheppers and others formed was an organisation called Rewilding, which was taking that Dutch model internationally across Europe, if you like. So we've got new rewilding organisations springing up across Europe. Some of them actually are managing rewilding sites as well. Others, like Rewilding Britain, are a more sort of promotional and advisory organisation. There's a whole set of demonstration rewilding projects in some very exciting places around it. And now there's sort of other investments coming in larger landscape projects. So that's sort of, well, Rewilding Europe was founded in 2012. In that 8 years, we're getting this, proliferation of really exciting projects across Europe. I was saying that it's still, they're all still early days, and although they look large on the map, they're quite small in reality. Another big development is this sort of, if you like, this action philosophy has been formalised into, or not formalised into, it's been communicated in a set of principles. And these were formed at a workshop of rewilding practitioners in Cuenca last year, which actually I facilitated. And it was this real feeling that, rewilding is quite a new approach. It may be unsettling for some people. It's really important as a movement to be absolutely clear about what is guiding rewilding, so that so that we can have a common purpose. You can interpret these in different places in different ways, but also so that people can understand what Rewilders are doing, and if you like, hold us to account for that as well. So I hope I've communicated some of these. I mean, a big one is lead with a vision, start with hope and purpose, thinking creatively, working at the scale of nature, letting nature lead, being very contextual, work with others. We talked about that with the brick company and aggregates, knowledge exchange and so forth. So it's quite a nice sort of restatement of how we might do conservation. And it's going in some really interesting directions now. I mean, these, thinking about how we can work with these restored forces of nature to find solutions to climate change. There's a lot of work going on rewilding with herbivores to reduce the fire load, to address wildfires in Iberia. This is a massive, the Dutch are just amazing. This is a massive rewilding project in the Markermeer, where there's a big problem with siltation of this shallow sea from agricultural runoff. And they just built this natural filter using rewilding principles, which is rather wonderful. So there's a lot of inspiration out there, which people can take inspiration and aspirations from. So then, just to finish here, could we think of doing any rewilding in Oxford? Is it really possible? And just to say, one of the key principles of rewilding is to rewild within the constraints of what is possible. You don't have to go for the full herbivore assembly. It's just that spirit of just trying to restore ecosystem processes. So one thing we could do, to rewild, we need 7 things basically to do this. Vision, we need land, we need the buy-in of everybody to do it, we need support, we need animals, we need money, but also we need entrepreneurs. One of the small things I was thinking about during COVID was, maybe all of us were looking into our gardens a little bit more. What about rewilding our backyards? And I do think there's scope for this here. If we're taking those principles, I know there's a lot of work done on rewilding, on wildlife gardening, but just one sort of little thing. Many of us have, live in, if you like, terrace type houses or houses with these linear gardens, and we have the fences between them. Just removing a back fence panel and putting in one of those trellis panels, that really addresses that dimension of dispersal. It allows animals to move between gardens, just insects and birds, and airflows as well on that. So we can sort of move a notch up on the scale by doing something like that. We can also, if you like, be a natural herbivore and dig up the garden, create a little bit more natural disturbance at the back, or be an incompetent garden and sort of accidentally on purpose tread on things, just so there's a bit more dynamics going in there. So even at a very, this is land we, those of us who are lucky enough to have a house with a garden, have some control over. So we could be backyard rewilders if we want. On a slightly larger scale, I do look at Port Meadow quite a lot. And Port Meadow is an interesting one because we have this quite large hectare area right in the town centre, and we have all the animals here. Port Meadow's full of big herbivores, grazing away rather beautifully and creating a very nice grassland ecosystem for that, and the river's a little bit natural. And then we have Burgess Field, which you can see in here. It's sort of developing into quite a nice, messy, scrub-like habitat, but it's a little bit static because it doesn't have that natural disturbance and grazing in it. So you do wonder whether there ever might be a possibility, or whether a possibility we might discuss is just removing the fence between Burgess Field and Port Meadow and allowing the cattle and horses just to graze up here and come back down. This would certainly benefit the ecology of Burgess Field, and it would probably benefit the ecology of Port Meadow as well. And we get that sense of more, there we would be, we'd be moving up the dispersal side, we'd get much more natural disturbance on it. And I think we'd find the trophic, the web of life starting to build on Burgess Field. So that could be a possibility. I think that's quite a good, an easy and cheap option. Well, I won't say it's easy because I haven't talked to anybody about this and what the commoners feel about it, but theoretically at least, that they wouldn't need a lot of effort to do that. And then a lot of us rewilders, we do look at Otmore. and I'm sure many of you go down to Otmore of know it, just on the northern outskirts of the town, and one of the biggest areas of land, of natural area in sort of unbuilt area in the county, perhaps 2,000 hectares, part of the old Burnwood Forest, if you like, an area ripe to rewild. However, with Otmore, it's an interesting one, is that the RSPB have invested very heavily in acquiring land and managing land in Otmore, and they're really, this was really to take the conventional approach to landscaping and managing for particular target species to not its logical extreme, but to scale that up. So this is a highly landscaped and a highly managed landscape, and it's really there to try and increase the populations of wetland wading species, redshanks, curlew, and lapwing. So I think Otmore, although it's probably it'd be a brilliant, it could be a brilliant rewilding site, it would create that that need to move from one management paradigm to another management paradigm, and I think we can all understand that could be quite hard to do. So just to conclude, I hope I haven't run over too much. We might ask, well, why rewild? I hope I've given you a sort of reasonable scientific arguments and the practical arguments to doing it. Science, well, we can rebuild, we can give ourselves an upgrade. The cultural arguments, can give ecosystems an argument. The cultural arguments, we can reimagine nature, and the economic arguments, if you like, we can address flood risk, big challenges, create new nature-based enterprises. But sometimes I think that maybe one of the reasons to invest or rewild is because when we look at history, nature conservation was a major cultural force during the 20th century. The rise of national parks, the rise of Attenborough TV programs, it really is part of the 20th century culture. If we want to maintain that love of nature and that desire to conserve nature into the 21st century, we've got to reinvent the conservation movement. The ideas, the logics, the sense of conservation of the 1980s. It's not what these young people want. They're a different generation. And I do think that one of the opportunities we do have with rewilding is to sort of create a new, more hopeful, positive environmentalism, one which is ambitious, innovative, a journey of uncertainty, and which is fit for a very rapidly changing century. So I think that this, for me, this is what motivates me the most of rewilding, is reinventing, reinvigorating the conservation movement, which I've been lucky to have been part of, since the 1970s. So thanks very much. I hope that was a reasonable introduction to rewilding, and you enjoyed it. And I look forward to hearing your questions and any thoughts or discussion on that.
Thank you very much, Paul. You've kept exactly to time, so no worries there. I do have a few questions that have come in already, so if I can just relay those.
Yeah.
So first one was that around Oxford there's been a lot of anti-wilding, somebody says. This is from Nicholas Lawrence. For example, the A34 cut through Bagley Wood. Is there any hope of reversing something like this? What, reversing the A34? Where we've had damage, I suppose, where a landscape's been damaged, such as places like, I suppose, like Magdalen Wood being split from Brasenose Woods, for example, and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, this, and it's quite difficult. So damage is damage, and it's done. I think what rewilding is saying is that it's a sort of pragmatic view and saying, well, how can we offset that damage? So we damage that, but can we look for areas where we could create new natural assets? So if we're thinking of Bagley Wood or Magdalen Wood, those are wonderful natural assets. They were created a long time ago for a different purpose, and over time, some of those assets has got degraded. Maybe just like some of our buildings fall down, or we lose them. A lot of what rewilding is saying, yeah, okay, we'll do our best not to make that happen, but by offering, this idea of, well, we can create new natural assets, rewilded assets as well, maybe, into the future, we come out, better off than we were on it.
there's a few suggestions coming in for other places that could be rewilded around Oxford. So Shotover,
Yeah.
Boars Hill and Whiteham Woods.
Yeah.
And also somebody, Claire Farley, suggested, can we use rewilding to avoid the flood channel project, the flood alleviation scheme? Is there something that should have been done in a rewilding sense to achieve the same ambition there?
So let me take those one off. So I look at Shotover quite a lot, actually. So, you know, you look at these things, oh, can we do rewilding here and what have you? I think the trouble with Shotover is it's so well walked, and it's, you know, and it's so well walked with, you know, dogs and people and kids and what have you. It would be a little bit difficult to do rewilding there. And I think people have, although it's, you know, not naturally, it's a regenerated woodland, I think people are really attached to that woodland feel of it. So I felt that there might be a lot of resistance to rewilding there, and it's quite, you know, I think that's one where you would just irritate a lot of people. Whereas, you know, if you say that Port Meadow one, the idea that the horses can graze onto Birch's field, and people are already used to interacting with horses and cattle, as are cattle with humans and dogs, that one seems to be slightly less resistance, if you like. So Shotover is definitely worth thinking about, though, but it wasn't on my priority list in that sense. Whiteham Woods, I think, is an absolute no. Well, in some ways, it's a bit of a no-go. Because it's got such a long research history to it. So fundamentally, Whiteham Woods is a research asset. And one of the things we have talked about is actually that research asset was for studying woodlands and scientific questions which are about that particular type of nature, and it does that really well. It would be fantastic to have a rewilding site which was another research site for Oxford, to be researching this new, sort of the new ecology, and also doing a much more integrated science. So as well as studying, you know, the ecology of a woodland or the ecology of a rewilding, we're actually understanding the interactions between that and finance and development, which we've just talked about. You know, the conservation science now, it's very integrated, you know, public attitudes, or, you know, how we perceive nature. So there could be, you know, I think that's the idea, is that a lot of what rewilding is about is that we don't do it in already good sites, because, you know, we need to conserve those as they are, partly as a source for others. You know, we look for new areas where rewilding could be done. And then the flood one was the last one, yeah?
Yeah, flood, yeah.
Yeah, so this is something a little bit more fundamental, and it goes into, you know, the philosophy of flood management. And rewilding is very much involved in natural flood management, which is that Geldersay Port example I gave you. That was rewilding so that you didn't have to build channels all the way around Nijmegen on it. You were allowing the river to expand upstream on it, and that takes the flood pressure off it. But we're still, you know, I mean, I had these discussions where the Environment Agency is starting to look at natural flood management, but it's not yet really looking, it's only just starting to think about rewilding. And there's a huge constraints on it in the UK because of the way land is owned and the way rivers are owned as well. The Dutch did have a more supportive policy to do what they did than we currently have. So could we have avoided the channels with rewilding? Yeah, but we need a real change in policy to do that, and the willingness of our bureaucrats to actually entertain radical new ways of doing things.
A couple of questions about apex predators. The first one says, is it absolutely necessary to have them involved in the systems? And then following on from that, do we have to become the apex predator if we can't introduce wolves and the rest? Yeah.
So we do need an apex predator, and a lot of, you know, so when I focus on herbivores, so in some ways getting the herbivores going is the first step, and then, you know, in continental Europe the big predators just walk in. You don't really have to think about reintroducing them. We would have to probably in the UK. So you do need an apex predator, and partly one of the reasons we need an apex predator, because without an apex predator, what we call the mesio predators, the middle-sized ones, the foxes, the badgers, and so forth, they become super predators, because actually the big predators will predate on those meso predators, and that means they're always a little bit scared, and they don't hunt as systematically, or they don't spend a long time there. Once you take the big predators out there, and this is a big problem a lot more, they're not scared of anything, so they just systematically look at things and, you know, find the bird's nest, sort of eat all the small mammals or whatever. So we sort of do need a big predator in there, and of course something, you know. So yeah, this is a really difficult one, because without lynx, well, lynx would have, you know, that's the one which I think would, everybody knows, could fit into the UK landscape without anybody knowing, probably. But the bigger ones we got missing, probably we as humans have to play that role. And actually, we always were an apex predator, always have been an apex predator in it. But of course, that, you know, us playing a predator, that's not really in line with where we are culturally in terms of a move to, you know, really, you know, strong animal welfare sentiments, the move to vegetarianism and veganism. Yes. But again, that company I mentioned in Wageningen, the Free Nature, runs this wild meat business, they're sort of acting as the super predator, but they're also acting as the force of starvation. So where animals would starve naturally, they feed them up for animal welfare concerns and then harvest them later. But they keep that natural dynamic coming in. So there is quite an important question about our role in rewilding. Personally, I'm saying, well, you know, let's be the predator and rethink how we hunt. But that's not a very popular viewpoint.
Another question about, do the wild animals still need vets? So that sort of plays into that.
Yeah, these are fantastic questions. So this is what I was really involved in, is the policy side of it. You know, there's a question, is rewilding legal on it? So while the large animals are classed as livestock, then they are covered by farm animal law. And, you know, if they're ill, you have to bring a vet in. You know, when they calve, you have to put an ear tag on them. If you move it, you know, so they're subject to all of that while they're classed as domestic on it. And we don't really have a policy which allows animals to be kept wild. So, you know, they can live a natural life, and you don't have to bring the vet in, but they're still slightly owned. You imagine if you know, these herds, if you're trying to restore herds and you have to bring a vet in if they get ill, that is, well, it's dangerous for the vet, but it requires that you have infrastructure in. You know, you need to put in crushes and fences, and it's incredibly traumatic for the animals as well. So this is the big policy challenge of rewilding, is finding that balance, and we're nowhere near that in the UK. They've nearly got it in the Netherlands, or they've got some relaxation in the Netherlands.
There's a couple of questions about sort of marginal areas, so using roadside verges, for example, and also whether we can use things like college sports fields and certainly areas around those. Is there scope for sort of small scale projects?
Well, you know, it's interesting this. So, you know, this sort of, if you like, the ethos of rewilding, of moving up on those three scales, and you don't have to have the large herbivores in. The idea that, you know, you've got the 10 where it's a full assemblage of large herbivores and, you know, the predators, and, you know, something we can imagine of in the Southern Carpathians or somewhere like that. Or we can increasingly imagine in Scotland, actually. We can't imagine that in Oxford. But if we imagine rewilding on a scale of 0 to 10, we will put a college playing field at 0, probably. No disrespect to the college playing field, but they're highly managed. But if we could move that up 2 or 3 notches on that scale of rewilding, those axes I talked about, that'd be something pretty amazing, something to be really satisfied with. And of course, we do have, although it's a little bit managed, we do have to sort of have that in Hog Acres, which is an old university, you know, the Eco Park, which is an old playing field. So I think there are pocket rewildings we could do around the town. You know, if the colleges felt that they might, you know, they want to keep the land asset, if you like, but it's too expensive or not viable to have them as college playing fields. But of course, you know, they're private organisations, so that would be their choice on it. But, you know, I'm sure there's scope for that a bit more.
There's lots more questions, but I'm conscious that we're just coming up to the hour, so I think I should probably hand back to Gillian. But thank you again from me, Paul, and back to Gillian to just wrap up things.
Right. Thanks very much. Well, thank you, Paul, and thanks to the audience for your interesting questions. I have one quick question. Are there any projects that are currently ongoing in the UK, Paul?
Any rewilding projects?
Yeah.
Yeah, there is actually. So in the UK, rewilding has really is being pioneered by the owners of large estates. And of course, you know, the book we talked about, Wilding by Isabella Tree, that is the rewilding of the Knepp Castle estate down in Sussex. When we're looking to Scotland, Scotland is getting quite interesting. There's 3 or 4 rewilding projects, you know, well underway. Glenfeshie is a good example of that. Allerdale is of another example. And then there's about 20 projects sort of in the early stages of happening. But partly because, you know, we touched on about these policy things and about, you know, you know, you can't do it in existing nature reserves too well. It is in the UK. It is a little bit of a model farm model of rewilding, if you like. It's done on large estates, but I think we'll see that broadening out over time.
It's young. It's
early days.
It's early days, isn't it? Yes. Yeah. Well, there was certainly a lot to consider, and I think a lot of people will think more carefully about how they use their garden spaces. If they've got large land, they might think about other things. I think it's a very exciting prospect that we have in mind, and I think maybe people should buy the book and just see what else they can learn. Not only yours, but maybe the book on wilding by Isabella Tree.
Yeah. Can I just say, so if you don't mind just commenting, I'm just looking at the chat. So Priscilla's question, can rewilding be integrated with agriculture? Priscilla, in those estates, it is being integrated in agriculture. And when we're talking about those herbivore assemblies, you can stick stock in, though, you know, you can sort of, you know, well, people are using longhorn cattle as well, so you can do it. And then just to say, I really like Daniel's suggestion of, you know, build back better. Should we be talking about wild back better? Well, I'll go along with that, Daniel.
Oh, that's very good. That's right. That's right. Yeah, excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much, Paul. It was a very interesting talk, and I'm sure lots of people will be thinking about what you've said and perhaps suggesting other things. You're willing to have your PowerPoint put on the OCS website, are you? So people can look at your slides with a bit more detail?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, we'll talk to you about that later. Anyway, thank you very much, Paul, and thank you for your questions, people. Before you go, can I just remind you of our next webinar talk, which takes place on the 19th of October. And Liz Woolley, our local historian, will be talking about the life of Olive Gibbs, the Oxford politician and peace campaigner. If you want to join the talk, members will find a link in the e-bulletin. Non-members can contact our website to request a registration link, and either group can register via Eventbrite. So it's all on our website. And finally, can I do a plug for the Society? OCS is an entirely volunteer-run charitable organisation, and we depend on our membership fees to allow us to continue to function as this independent voice of Oxford, which you know we represent. If you're not already a member, please consider joining us. Our subscription rates are very reasonable. £15 for an individual, £25 for a joint membership, £5 for students. And as you've experienced tonight, and probably other talks, we provide an interesting and diverse programme of events. We've also got many focus groups. And if you're interested in a particular area, planning, housing, transport, we would welcome new volunteers. So that's something else for you to think about. So thank you, everybody, and good night.